There we go. Okay. I was trying to make sure that I had the proper screen to share with everyone today. And let me see here if I could make that work. Okay, good. Okay. It is 12 o'clock noon. In fact, it's probably a minute after 12. Hopefully, you can see the slide. If you can, just wave your hand. Okay, great. What I thought we would do today is spend time just acknowledging what so many in the circles of Christianity, especially in the churches of Christ, sometimes we try to avoid, but the truth of the matter is we really cannot successfully avoid it. And that is talking about the impact of history upon the church and how the church is actually the benefactor of so many things that have taken place historically. So, what I thought I would do today, since this is the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, is talk about just the progressive uh, change that has taken place in the United States and how that progressive change has had a significant impact on Christianity in the United States. Uh, so I've got, I guess about 8 slides that I want to share with you that um, I put together just so we can get a feel for the history of this whole civil rights movement on the church and Christianity. Instead of just talking about Dr. King and the I Have a Dream speech, let's start back during the era of Reconstruction post-Civil War. Although the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments outlawed slavery, provided for equal protection under the law, guaranteed citizenship, and protected the right to vote, individual states continued to allow unfair treatment of minorities and then began to pass Jim Crow laws allowing segregation of public facilities. Now, these were upheld by the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, and I'll talk more detail about that in an upcoming slide or two. But this Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court ruling found that state laws requiring racial segregation, they were separate, but they were equal and they were constitutional. Now, this may not mean a lot to you, but it really helps individuals to understand why, when you hear people fighting so much for state rights, it's saying the Supreme Court, it's saying Congress, and it is also saying the President of the United States have no business intervening in state matters. Well, that was basically the ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson. It was basically saying whatever the states dictate, whatever the states mandate, whatever the states say is right, whatever the states say are not right or is not right, that's just the law. And that's kind of where we almost got to about a week ago, to where people came from the 50 states saying that what you guys are saying in terms of vote tally, in terms of what is going to be rendered, what has been said by the Supreme Court, it doesn't matter, because we come from the respective states. And what we're saying from the respective states overrules what the federal laws say. Now, let me go back. Let me share with you a source so that you'll know. There's a publishing company or a publisher called Thought Company, and this material is taken from Lisa Vox in a December 20th article that she wrote about the progression of civil rights. And I thought it was an excellent, well-written document through Thought Company by Lisa Vox. And this was just recently in December of 2020. Also continuing with Lisa's article, after the end of Reconstruction, white Southerners regained political power and set about reordering race relationships. Sharecropping became the compromise that ruled the Southern economy, and a number of Black people said, forget it. Now, I grew up in the South, and I'm very familiar with sharecropping. Keep in mind that many of the recently freed Blacks did not own land. They had worked on plantations, but the Southern farmers, once emancipation took place, the Southern farmers did not have slave workers to work their land for free. So what they did was came up with this thing called sharecropping. In other words, if we supply the goods, the land, the seeds, the equipment for you, we will give you a percentage of the harvest. The problem with that was the people who own the land, the people who had the resources actually kept moving the goalpost. So at the end of the harvest season, the field hands, former slaves who were doing the manual labor, basically would come up empty handed, because what they were aware of, but they couldn't refute it, is they had this bill where the owner of the property said, well, you owe me for food, you owe me for lodging, I gave you a cash advance, you got sick, I had to buy this, I had to buy that. So at the end of the harvest season, many of the laborers came up empty, or they got a very minimal amount of return for the amount of work that they had expended. So therefore, many of the sharecroppers began to move from the rural communities into the southern cities. Now, this is how I would illustrate that. I grew up on a farm in a place that had 3 or 4 different names: Proctor, Arkansas, Amancy, Arkansas, Riceville, Arkansas, Wine Oak, Arkansas. Everybody knew those were rural communities. But when people got fed up with sharecropping, they moved to West Memphis, Arkansas. West Memphis was the big city in eastern Arkansas. They left the farm. And many cities that happened. In Mississippi that happened. In Georgia that happened. In Louisiana that happened. All over the South, people left the farms and they moved to the southern cities, and they left farm life behind. Now, as the Black population in the southern cities grew, whites began passing restrictive segregation laws, demarcation in urban spaces along racial lines. We call it redlining. Living across the tracks. You can't go to school in certain areas. You can't go shopping in certain areas. Those type things. Restaurants were segregated, parks were segregated. Now, this new racial order became Jim Crow, and it did not go unchallenged. One notable court case that I mentioned earlier, and I'll talk to you about that now, was Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, the bigger question is, when you look at the history of Ferguson, Plessy is going to challenge the Louisiana laws, but there's a man by the name of John Howard Ferguson, which is a very interesting individual when you read his history. And that's why I put that in the presentation for today. And you say, I thought we were going to talk about Martin Luther King. We are, but you've got to understand how we got to Martin Luther King to really appreciate Martin Luther King. John Howard Ferguson was an American lawyer and judge from Louisiana, most famous for his as the defendant in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Ferguson was born the third and the last child, I want you to get this, to Baptist parents on June 10th, 1838. That's when one of my oldest sisters was born. That's when one of my nephews were born, June 10th, not 1838, but June 10th. The son, grandson, great-grandson, and great-great-grandson of Martha's Vineyards, Master Marines, John Howard Ferguson, chose a different vocation path and taught school in his early years, finally setting about to study law. Now, Baptist parents, and he's from Massachusetts. That's what I want you to get now. Young Ferguson's family was all but wiped out between 1849 and 1861, and after the Civil War ended, he had completed his legal studies in Boston under the tutelage of Benjamin F. Hallett. Ferguson moved to New Orleans in 1865. You see, right around the end of the Civil War. There he met and married in July of 1866 Virginia Butler Earhart, daughter of Thomas Jefferson Earhart, a staunch and outspoken abolitionist from Pennsylvania. Now, he's the son of Baptist parents from Boston. He has a law degree, and he marries a woman whose family are abolitionists. They are against slavery. The Fergusons raised three sons in Burkeville, uptown New Orleans, at 1500 Henry Clay Avenue. The house still stands today and is designated a historical landmark of the 1989 Orleans Parish. Now, this is what I want you to see, how politics and power can cause a person to work against what they know is right. Ferguson served in the Louisiana legislature and practiced law in New Orleans until he was tapped in 1892 for a judgeship at the Criminal District Court, Section A, for the parish of New Orleans, Louisiana. There he presided over the case of Homer Adolph Plessy and the state of Louisiana. Well, see, we don't read about Plessy versus the state of Louisiana. We read about Plessy versus Ferguson. Well, who's the lawyer that represented the state of Louisiana? It was Ferguson. So you've got a man who's from Boston and grew up in a Baptist family. This is strange business. He marries a young lady who is raised in an abolitionist family. But he is an attorney in the South. And he gets a job. He serves in the Louisiana legislature. And he is given a high-profile case. And you know what he does? He takes it. It makes you wonder, why did he take the case? Was it because he didn't know any better? Or was it because now he inside himself feel like he's somebody? Now, up until 1954, the US Civil Rights Movement kept challenging the Jim Crow laws in courts based on facilities not being equal. Well, Howard Ferguson had perpetuated that all the way up until 1954. But the strategy changed with Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, when Thurgood Marshall, remember him, the first African-American Supreme Court justice, argued that separate facilities were inherently unequal. And then in 1955, the bus boycotts, the sit-ins in the 60s, and the freedom rides became more prevalent. Now, during the year of my birth, 1954, following World War II, pressures to recognize, challenge, and change inequalities for minorities just began to grow. One of the most notable changes to the status quo was the 1954 landmark Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. And it challenged this notion of separate but equal in public education. It concentrated on a certain area. You see, they said, well, let's not fight all of the segregation, but if we can get a case law in one, then we can use that as a case law against other areas of segregation. If we can show that one violates the 14th Amendment, then we can show that everything that's segregated violates our rights under the 14th Amendment. And it was that decision that polarized Americans, fostered debate, and served as a catalyst to encourage federal action to protect civil rights. This guy, Fred Gray, this is a photograph from a Stanford University photo. But Fred Gray is a member of the Church of Christ. Many of you, if you've been around us long enough, you met Fred Gray. With the first inauguration of President Barack Obama, that was what, 12 years ago now? Brother Gray was our guest at the Prince George's Church of Christ. He spoke that morning. We had a fellowship following morning service. But Fred Gray was a young man from Montgomery, Alabama, born December 14th, 1930. He was ordained as a Christian minister as a teenager. Following high school, he received a BS from Alabama State College for Negroes, a law degree from Case Western. The reason he ended up at Case Western in Cleveland, Ohio, is because in the state of Alabama, he could not attend law school. He then returned after he finished Case Western. He returned to Montgomery. And one of the sayings that Brother Gray, if I called him right now, he would say, my goal was to destroy everything segregated in the South, especially in Alabama. But he went back home and he opened a private law firm, which is still in Tuskegee, Alabama today. I've been to his office, but he's an elder now at the Holt Street Church of Christ in Montgomery. Well, he used to be an elder there. His son now, Fred Gray Jr., is one of the elders there. But Brother Gray, when I lived in Alabama, he was one of the elders there. He loves preaching. He loves the church. He loves the church. I want to say that. When Dr. King met him, not only was he a lawyer, but he was also a Christian and he was also a preacher when he met Dr. King. Now, during the Montgomery bus boycott, see, everybody remember that. And Rosa Parks, Miss Parks, the Montgomery bus boycotts. But this is the connection between the church, Christianity, and Dr. King. During the Montgomery bus boycott, Gray's leadership and legal counsel played a crucial role in the successful desegregation of Montgomery buses. He defended Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks against charges of disorderly conduct for refusing to give up their seats to white passengers. Gray also filed the petition that challenged the constitutionality of Alabama state laws mandating segregation on buses. Now, you see, from the school situation, they won that in the Brown versus Board of Education to say, if segregation in one area is wrong in a state, in Topeka, Kansas, then we can say as a case precedent, segregation in another law is wrong. regardless of the state, because we've got a case law. Well, guess who is now making the case on behalf of Rosa Parks? Well, guess who came to Montgomery to lead the bus boycotts? It was Dr. King, and the attorney was Fred Gray. In November of 1956, the Supreme Court affirmed the lower court ruling that racial segregation on public transportation was unconstitutional. Gray recalled that he and King occasionally had differences of opinion on what actions should be taken to ensure that rights were protected. Gray said there were times when Dr. King said, Fred, I understand what you say the law is, but our conscience says that the law is unjust and we cannot obey it. So if we are arrested, we will be calling on you to defend us. Some people ask, well, I didn't see Brother Gray on the front lines. Brother Gray's response would always be, somebody had to be behind the lines to make sure that everything was in place in case something happened to the people on the front line. That's where the church, that's where Christ, that's where the members many times, especially Fred Gray, was always involved in this. Now, this is what we know about mostly. Back during Johnson's administration with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But now, if you recall, in November of 1963, John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. Well, it was John F. Kennedy who put this ball in motion about the Civil Rights Act. But because of his assassination in November of 1963, and keep in mind, from President Kennedy to the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, during that era, people weren't in a big hurry. They didn't have an appetite to sign this Civil Rights Act. But ultimately, they do in 1964. Kennedy's assassinated, Vice President Johnson becomes president, and within hours of his passage on July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson, if you look at the picture, who's standing behind him? Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Heights, Roy Wilson, and John Lewis, and other civil rights leaders were in attendance, and they signed the bill into law, declaring once and for all that discrimination for any reason on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin were illegal in the United States of America. Now, let's look at some of the more notable marches of Dr. King, because normally we think about the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks, and then we think of the Edmund Pettus Bridge situation, Bloody Sunday in 1965. But I wanted you to see some of the more major events that Dr. King was involved in that we don't talk about. And looking at this, you'll understand more globally. That's why we have a Martin Luther King holiday. In 1955 and 1956, sort of the thing that launched this was that Montgomery bus boycott. That's kind of the foundational launching pad. In 1961, in Albany, Georgia, there was a movement about the rights of citizens in Albany, Georgia. The Birmingham protests. I remember the letter from the Birmingham jail. That was in 1963. And then in 1963 also, it was the March on Washington. All you're going to see today is the I Have a Dream. Well, that was the end of the speech. That wasn't the speech. But that took place right downtown Washington in 1963. In 1964, Dr. King receives the Nobel Peace Prize at the University of Oslo. In March of 1965, this is another point that we remember, is the Bloody Sunday of the Edmund Pettus Bridge down in Selma, Alabama. When we were moving from Oklahoma to Alabama, we crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and it was a very sobering journey to go across that bridge, knowing the history of what had happened in 1965. In 1966, in Chicago, Illinois, in the North Lawndale area on the west side, the poor side, Dr. King was there in a march of about 700 people, and one of the protesters, a white protester, hit him in the head with a brick. Dr. King's response was, of all of the marches he had been in, this was one of the most heinous and the most hate-filled among citizens that he had ever experienced in his life. And what took him by surprise in that march, you don't see Chicago as being South, but he said it was worse than anywhere in the South he had been. And he did not anticipate that. In 1967, he was a staunch opponent to the Vietnam War protest. And it appears as if, because of this Vietnam War protest, many of his white backers pulled out. Many blacks didn't want him to come speak. Many black religious people separated themselves from him, because now he's speaking out not on a racial issue, but he's speaking out on a political issue. And people didn't like that. But then in 1968, the Sanitation March in Memphis, Tennessee, that takes place less than 15 miles from where I was born and raised. Now, what people don't realize is that during that sanitation march in Memphis, the march took place, but it got out of control. And during that march in Memphis with the sanitation workers, they basically had to disband the march. So when Dr. King was assassinated, April in Memphis, Tennessee of 1968, he was preparing for a second march. That was his return trip to Memphis, because he wanted to complete the march that had been disrupted by people from inside the march, they thought. But what they found out is that march was infiltrated and that march was sabotaged. So the night before Dr. King's murder, Dr. King was not planning to go anywhere. That there was a sort of a rally at a huge Mason's temple in North Memphis, and the people were there. It was a storm that night, pouring down rain, and they wanted Dr. King to come to the temple. He wasn't feeling well. Something was going on in his spirit. He knew something was happening. People say he had been threatened, and people say that he knew he was going to be killed in Memphis, Tennessee. I don't know that to be true, but people were saying there was something unsettled about him. Ralph Abernathy calls him at his hotel room at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, when you look at the Lorraine, if any of you've been to Memphis, Tennessee, the Lorraine Hotel was in the ghetto. It was in the poor side of Memphis. I've been by the Lorraine. When people were traveling, when you talk about the Green Book, if blacks were traveling through Memphis, they couldn't stay at the Holiday Inn. The only hotel that welcomed them was the Lorraine Hotel, or motel as it was called. So Dr. King could have stayed at the Holiday Inn, but he opted to stay at the Lorraine Hotel. And that's the room that he was in when he got the call from Ralph Abernathy. You need to come. The people are here. It's packed. He got up, he got dressed, he went over there. And that's where he made the speech, unrehearsed, about he had been to the mountaintop. I may not get there with you. That was made the last night of his life. And then we began to wonder, how in the world did that man get the Nobel Peace Prize? How did he get an official holiday? Why so much hoopla over Dr. Martin Luther King? When we talk about the Apostle Paul was a missionary, and he went from Jerusalem and he'd go into the Asia Minor area and he'd come back to the mainland, and then he'd go back into the Asia Minor area and he'd come back to the mainlands, and he'll end up on a ship headed to Rome. One of the interesting things about Dr. King, when you look at his major marches, they weren't overseas. They weren't in Africa. They weren't in the Caribbeans. They weren't in the European countries. His major journeys were in the South. Oh, I know he got stabbed in New York, but his major life sacrifices were among the poor people. And yet, because such a notable person sacrificed himself for those who were least positioned to do so, I believe God elevated him to where the world will never, ever forget Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I hope the little brief overview that I've shared with you today has helped you learn to appreciate why his legacy is so important in not just American history, not Southern history, not just Christian history, but in the world. There's nowhere in the world you can go where people have not heard of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Let me stop the share. And if there's anything that any of you, especially on Zoom, would like to comment on, or I'm monitoring the Facebook page, I will yield to you at this time.
Dr. King, Dr. McClure, it was interesting. My book club just read this book called Vanguard, and it goes into some of the history. And it's interesting that it seemed that the church was the main source of, whether it was funding, whether it was organizing and coming together, that was, I think it was the AME Church was one of the main branches of denominations that really not only worked with the politics and the laws, but they also were really promoting education and trying to get, like Howard University and some of the things that, you mentioned, Dorothy Height and Martin Luther King, that they were as the shoulders that we stand on to see some of the huge milestones that were made as, Blacks in this country. So exactly. That was a very awesome presentation. I appreciated that.
Thank you so much. But what you're saying is 100% right. And I don't think there's any element of history, especially in the church community, that should ever try to ignore the contributions that Dr. King has made to the furtherance of even integration among churches. My wife and I were talking yesterday about the number of various churches, not only in the South, But even right here in the Washington, D.C. area, among churches of Christ that used to be all white, and now they're all black.
Right.
It's not because those churches went out of business. It's because as the black population in the communities began to grow, the white churches disappeared. I could tell you that about Oxon Hill. I could tell you that about Bowie, Laurel, Southeast, 16th and Decatur, Silver Spring. Those were almost 100% white churches. And now they're almost at least 50 to 75 to 80%, in some cases, 100% black.
Wow. Dr. McClure, with respect to that change in demographic, is the leadership still white?
Well, this is my pushback on that. They stayed white as long as they could, because the blacks were attending, but the blacks weren't in leadership. But then by the time the blacks did get in leadership, they had been indoctrinated so thoroughly by the white leadership that if you were blind, you couldn't tell the black leadership from the white leadership.
How about that? Wow.
Because they had indoctrinated them.
Mm.
So a lot of the black culture opportunities still were not welcomed in many of those churches.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, look, I'm glad that we had time to spend today. It's a holiday, and what I try to do is to redeem the times to make sure that some of the topics we talk about are applicable to the season that we're in. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you so much for the contributions that have been made through the centuries by so many pioneers of history, so many pioneers in the religious circles that have made our liberty, our freedom, our opportunities possible today. And as we have designated as a country Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday as a national holiday, I just pray that we will be reflective, and yet we will be thankful for the contributions he has made to make our freedom even more possible. Bless us this day, and I pray that you will bless us, especially in the events that we await on Wednesday and the coming days. Through Jesus, I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. All right. Well, look, everybody have a safe day today, and just continue to pray for our country, especially as we approach the inauguration on Wednesday, because I think that's going to be a very testy time, if not here in Washington, D.C., certainly in the United States of America somewhere. Okay, God bless. Everybody be safe.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
McClure.
Okay.
Dr. McClure for now.
Bye.